Hello, this is product attorney Jason Oakes, and this is your Wyoming Health Watch. Really excited tonight to talk about one of the issues that I'm most interested in, which is how the private sector is dealing with some of the major hot topic political issues going on right now in our country. I think this will be a fascinating discussion and a fascinating thing to watch as it develops, because many of these issues are going to be dealt with even before our 2020 presidential election. And the ones I'm talking about that come to the surface most quickly is climate crisis litigation, gun control, and also public health. I want to talk about all three of these individually. But first, I want to start with ever since Trump was elected, and I'm not getting into political sides one way or the other, but I want to take on both sides in this podcast. Ever since Trump was elected, it seems that everyone's opinions on today's hot political topics have only deepened. I'm sure you're like me, and you have witnessed people who were once well-reasoned and rational with their thoughts now taking positions on issues that they never would have taken years ago with the same oil and vinegar that they are doing today. Let me give you an example. This is an obvious example, but let's talk about it. Republicans were ready to hang Bill Clinton for engaging in consensual sexual acts with a 21-year-old intern, and Democrats were all too ready to defend him 20 years ago. And yet today, Republicans, the whole thing has been switched, has been flip-flopped. The Republicans staunchly defend a president who knowingly cheated on his wife, paid off a porn star, and then lied about it. And while the Democrats are looking for blood during the ongoing impeachment proceedings. So it's interesting that these issues come to full circle. The reality is that today's political chaos is frankly exposing, in my opinion, the irrational beliefs of many who clearly are placing politics on a higher pedestal than their own morals and integrity. And many of us are guilty of this. I'm not pointing fingers, I'm just pointing out the obvious. Regardless of whether we try and rationalize it, we have our own confirmation bias where we are accepting the information that helps our position that we've already determined is going to be the way that we're going to defend a certain topic before we've undertaken the efforts to fully evaluate that issue or topic. We've each seen this same behavior when it comes to political red button issues that are permeating throughout our politics today, and the most notable of which includes climate change and gun control, although I would submit that abortion is a very close third. And no matter how polarizing politics is becoming, no matter how unreasonable or irrational both sides are becoming with these specific issues, I would respectfully submit it's a total waste of time for people to be debating these issues in the political realm. Why? Because the private sector will have hashed out these issues long before Washington does, and I submit that these issues will be either hashed out or very close to it by the time the 2020 presidential election rolls around a year from now. Let's start first by discussing the climate crisis litigation. I've been the only one talking about this issue, I think in the entire country, but certainly in the Rocky Mountain region. Climate crisis litigation, make no mistake, is moving like a steam engine through our court systems and seeking their day of reckoning at trial. This is a very concerning area if you are a Wyoming or a Texas or a state that relies heavily on the fossil fuel industry. As I am giving this podcast, the New York Attorney General is in the middle of a bench trial against the fossil fuel giant Exxon. I've already podcasted about this issue, but for those of you who haven't had a chance to listen to my podcast, the New York Attorney General, in that case against Exxon, has alleged that Exxon duped investors by misrepresenting their contribution and role in climate change. In opening statements, the New York Attorney General made it crystal clear to the judge, it's a bench trial, not a jury, that he was going to be asking the court to award $1.6 billion, that's billion with a B, in damages against Exxon. While that case was pending last week, and as it continues to pend, the Massachusetts Attorney General has filed an even broader complaint against Exxon, alleging much of the same as New York did, but an interesting distinguishing point is he included the public as part of the plaintiff class, whereas New York didn't. New York only included the investors. And with the public now included as part of the class asserted by the Massachusetts Attorney General, Exxon's exposure has increased exponentially. For example, if there is a verdict of $1.6 billion in the New York case, I would respectfully submit that the Massachusetts complaint, which places the enormity of Exxon's exposure extremely high, will blow the top off of any $1.6 billion award. And, of course, if New York gets a verdict, other states will undoubtedly follow with the effort to put pressure not only on Exxon to resolve these cases, but to make sure that they get their piece of the pie of this enormous amount of money that's going to be potentially percolating as a result of climate crisis litigation. So let's talk about this. Let's think about this for a moment. Exxon, we all know, is one of the biggest companies in the country, certainly one of the biggest countries in the world. And just think about for a moment that litigation against Exxon could be so big as to bring the company to its knees. That, my friends, was inconceivable 10 years ago. Yet today, it is not only conceivable, but it potentially could happen. The climate crisis litigation doesn't end there. Just last week, the U.S. Supreme Court denied hearing an emergency appeal by Exxon, BP, and Chevron in different climate crisis litigations where the defendants sought to get the U.S. Supreme Court to stay or stop an ongoing climate crisis litigation against each of them in various places throughout the United States. With the U.S. Supreme Court denying those petitions, their day of reckoning cannot be stopped. These items reflect the tiniest of slivers of climate crisis litigation waiting and maneuvering through the court systems for their day in court. Literally, ladies and gentlemen, hundreds of cases regarding climate crisis litigation are currently pending, and that number is increasing each and every day as the filings occur. For example, there's a class action pending right now in the very blue state of Oregon, seeking to hold a number of billion-dollar fossil fuel companies responsible for their role in various climate change issues. This case is going to be one to watch very closely because the plaintiffs are children. They're children who contend their health is being impacted by the company's careless attitudes towards their contribution to climate change. Though the court system has done everything in their power to try to stall and slow down this litigation, the efforts have finally exhausted themselves in this potentially enormous case, which I believe has the potential to absolutely bankrupt these companies. We'll see its day in court next year. And the verdict size could be a number that has never been seen before in American civil litigation. So what does this mean for states like Wyoming and Texas and other heavily reliant fossil fuel states? It means that the impact could be enormous, as the potential for major companies to go bankrupt is now a reality. Moreover, those fossil fuel states that continue to resist climate change and inject more and more lobbying money into our political system are frankly kidding themselves if they think such efforts will have even the slightest effect on our court system. It should also be keenly acknowledged by these states that these lawsuits are not going to be filed and tried in places like Wyoming and Texas, but rather places like New York and Massachusetts and California and Oregon, which in and of itself should spark deep conversation and forward thinking of what are otherwise generally considered the red states that rely heavily on fossil fuel to support the various programs in their state, much like my home state of Wyoming. The next 12 months will be an enormous barometer on this controversial political issue. Meanwhile, the one thing both sides of the political spectrum agree on is that little will occur politically until after the 2020 election. By that time, I believe that we will have seen how this issue plays out in the court system, and I predict it will not turn out well for the likes of Wyoming and Texas unless Wyoming and Texas begin to embrace forward thinking now. and get ahead of the curve. Some states have been much more willing to engage on these discussions than others, and Wyoming remains one of those states that could be left out in the dark if they do not begin the conversation soon. I now want to shift gears to gun control. This is another hot political topic across the United States. This is a hotly debated topic with both sides making very strong points, and it's certainly a hotly debated topic within my home state of Wyoming. On one hand, of course, we all know we have a Second Amendment that ensures Americans have the right to bear arms. Our Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and unless and until the Second Amendment is repealed, which I certainly don't expect in my lifetime, it remains a strong and nearly impenetrable argument. On the other hand, we have seen an epidemic of gun violence in this country like we have never seen before. Certainly the past 10 years have been unprecedented, and arguably it began almost 20 years ago, or a little more than 20 years ago, when I was living in Colorado, when I remember to this day being a high school student myself and hearing about Columbine High School. Today, high schools across the country are practicing live shooter drills rather than fire drills, and kids, instead of worrying about tomorrow's test, or instead of worrying about asking a girl out on a date, are worried about whether they will come home at night. I mean, it sounds like something you would expect in a country with no rule of law like Venezuela or something. Yet, it's unimaginable, but it's occurring in the greatest country in the world. I've lived in Montana, I've lived in Colorado, Texas, California, and Wyoming. I see both sides of the debate. In 3 of those 5 states that I've lived in, the overwhelming majority are anti-gun control, and their arguments are well-reasoned. In 2 of the states that I've lived in, the overwhelming majority was in favor of gun control, and in those states, their arguments too were well-reasoned and sound. Everyone in my home state of Wyoming readily acknowledges that there is a gun violence epidemic throughout the country. But on the other hand, I think people would revolt in this state against the government if there was a law that required citizens to give up their guns. I have been asked about this topic over and over again, and what, if anything, can be done to curb gun violence, while also preserving the right to own guns. I often hear Wyomingites tell me, why should I lose my guns when I've always been a responsible gun owner? I don't have an answer for them, and I would also agree, why should a responsible gun owner lose his rights because of a crazy man? But such an argument does not and should not prevent forward thinking and how to balance these 2 issues. Some Wyomingites have told me that Wyoming hasn't had a mass shooting or a school shooting, which underscores the responsible nature our state undertakes when it comes to guns. On the other hand, given my conversation with a student advocate in Casper, Wyoming last week, Casper being the 2nd largest city behind Cheyenne, about how guns are the only thing that is a bigger epidemic in the 2 high schools in Casper, with vaping coming in number 2. I worry, as did the advocate, that the question of whether a mass shooting happens in Wyoming is not a matter of if, but when. One way to potentially balance these 2 issues is lifting gun manufacturer and dealer immunity from civil litigation. The civil system is already designed to protect defendants from lawsuits without merit. Therefore, a defendant would not need to worry about a baseless claim. On the other hand, if a gun manufacturer or dealer was negligent in the design, manufacture, or sale of a gun, why should they not be held accountable just like any other corporation making products in America? I submit that the risk of liability would only increase scrutiny for the sale of guns and thereby increase the likelihood of guns getting into responsible hands, and also act as an additional line of defense for guns to getting into the wrong hands. If you, as a parent, fail to lock your guns up at night and your son, or I suppose your daughter, comes home upset from a party, retrieves your unsecured gun, and returns to the party and kills someone, I think you should be held liable for negligence. This would be an approach that I believe would balance the rights of gun owners under the Second Amendment and also make sure that guns don't get into the wrong hands. Nonetheless, my thoughts on this issue, and yours, frankly, are less and less relevant, as as the issue is already percolating through our court system now. Very few people know about this, but the U.S. Supreme Court this week denied review of an appeal that granted plaintiffs the right to pursue litigation against the gun manufacturer Remington. And this case stems from the Sandy Hook massacre we all know about, where I think it was 19 kindergartners were killed. This could have an enormous impact on future gun control. And additionally, just like climate crisis litigation, the more we see gun violence across our country, the more this issue will come to the forefront of our judicial system, shaping public policy one way or another. And ladies and gentlemen, just like climate crisis litigation, these cases are not going to be litigated in Wyoming and Texas. They're going to be litigated in places like California, Colorado, and Oregon, where there's already an automatic effort to reduce gun ownership and also put restrictions on gun control and possession. Now I want to switch gears to public health because I think this is another issue that's going to come to a head. This issue has long been a passion of mine. In 2011, many of you know I was prescribed a drug for a sinus infection, and within 24 hours of taking the drug, I felt pins and needles in both of my legs and an overall feeling of weakness and the inability to walk, although I could walk, but walked with struggle. I called my doctor 24 hours after starting the medication, and he told me immediately to stop the drug, and I did. Over the next 72 hours, I would lose all feeling below my chest, lose the ability to walk, the ability to urinate and move, and I was admitted to the emergency room almost dead. I was not expected to live through the night, but thanks be to God, my father, my wife, an intern, and a rheumatologist who had seen my condition only 3 times in his 35-year career, I was thankfully spared. I survived the night and over the next 4 weeks learned how to walk again, literally having to learn how to put one foot in front of the other. I slowly regained my strength and ultimately made a full recovery. Those dark days and nights having to fight the feelings of despair and worry, I will never forget, which is why I've decided to devote my career to dangerous product litigation. And here, public health is another area that I strongly believe we cannot rely on our government to do the work that must be done. There is too much influence and too much money. Let me give you an example. There have been 3 jury trials to date against the weed killer behemoth Monsanto. The verdicts have ranged on the low end from $80 million on the low end to $2 billion with a B on the high end, with each jury finding that the exposure that the plaintiff had to Roundup was a substantial factor in causing each of the plaintiff's blood cancer or non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Yet our EPA continues to allow this product to be sold on every hardware shelf across America without a single warning. I have come to the conclusion that litigation is likely and can destroy Monsanto in the Roundup weed killer litigation. I've come to the conclusion that people's lives will continue to be ruined by this product, while the EPA will continue to allow this product to be sold without warnings, which is why I am so thankful that we have the private sector to take on these issues, bring awareness and accountability when the government won't. As of this morning, there were more than 42,000 Roundup lawsuits pending against Monsanto, and from the publications that I've read, they expect 74,000 people to be diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma in 2020. This is just one of many examples. Johnson & Johnson's talcum powder is another example where our U.S. FDA has continued to take a back seat. J&J's talcum powder has been alleged to have asbestos contamination. And those familiar with asbestos know that there is zero amount of exposure that is considered safe. And even the slightest exposure can cause mesothelioma. I have tried the only mesothelioma case that has ever been tried in Wyoming. It was a death case, and we had to preserve our client's deposition via video as we knew he was dying. It was one of the most saddest and heartbreaking things I have ever done as a lawyer. I still remember vividly how his family welled up with tears as we played that video at the trial. Mesothelioma is an awful, awful disease, and it slowly suffocates you, ultimately drowning you in your own fluids. J&J has consistently taken the position that their talcum powder product does not contain any asbestos. However, juries have not agreed in all cases. For example, there was a case involving 22 plaintiffs that resulted in more than a $4 billion, that's billion with a B, award, including billions for punitive damages against Johnson & Johnson. Yet again, just like Roundup, the product is still on the shelf. As recent as last month, more than 30,000 bottles of Johnson & Johnson's talcum powder were removed from the shelves across the U.S. when, in fact, asbestos was discovered in routine testing. You can hear our podcast about that as well. I commend the private sector who refuses to be complacent with the efforts, or lack thereof, I should say, of our federal government. In conclusion, I believe that the issues I've discussed will be shaped in our future not by politics, not by politicians, and not by the voting booth, not even by special interest groups, but rather by judges and juries. And when juries shape these issues, it will represent a return of power to the people. Thank you for listening. I'm Jason Oakes. This is your Wyoming Health Watch. And if you'd like to hear this podcast again or hear other informative podcasts of today, please go to wyominghealthwatch.com. Have a great day.